So, folks, this is an introduction to what we've come to understand and speak about as the care and growth thematic. Just a few sort of rules of the game. If you don't mind, if you've got the connectivity, please keep your camera on and your mic muted. It's very helpful to me if I know who I'm talking to. I can actually see a face. Thanks, Stefan. Thank you, folks. I find it very challenging when I'm talking to myself. They say mad people do that, and there's already enough evidence for the fact that I actually ascribe to that category. So I prefer not to have any more. And also, this is basically going to be a 1-hour content dump. So if you don't mind, if you could keep any questions until the end. So that you can just get a sense of the narrative flow of the ideas. A little bit about me. That was me when I was younger and prettier. I'm now older and uglier. I started this business based on research I conducted at an organization called the Chamber of Mines Research Organization. I was employed by them in the 80s, and I established the business in 1990. Now, the Chamber of Mines Research Organization was actually quite a prestigious research outfit. I mean, they employed about 600 researchers, and at the time, they were actually the biggest privately funded research organization in the world. They were really massive outfit, but they specifically looked at research in the gold mining industry, and most of the work that was done was really of technical in nature. So they had, for instance, a lab that would look at things like rock mechanics, and then there was a lab that looked at explosive science and a lab that looked at ventilation. And believe it or not, there was a lab in this organization, and they actually called it this. They called it the Human Resources Laboratory. You can imagine what we did to people there in the kind of the early 80s, Anyhow, I mean, the Human Resources Laboratory employed me as a young anthropologist. And the key work that they were doing, the biggest project that they were dealing with at the time was in looking at conflict. Conflict, as you know, was a big issue in the gold mining industry. In fact, right across we were basically going through a civil war in the country at the time. So I was very fortunate to be drafted into this project, and the modus operandi of the work that was done was really historical in character. And what I mean by that is that if there was a fight on a mine, we would send a crew of researchers to the mine, and we would do a body count, find out who mobilized against who, what were the issues, where did the fight happen, and then we would take all of that information and basically do two things with it. We would add it to a document called the conflict diary, and the conflict diary really just tracked conflicts as they happened in the industry over time. It was like a record of what was going on. And then we also would send a report of the conflict back to the management of the mine concerned. By 84, so I had just really started, I'd been there for just over 2 years. By 84, the industry started getting twitchy about this work that we were doing, because the argument was basically this: it's very expensive and it's historical in character. I mean, a general manager of a mine would tell me something like, you guys, there's a fight on my mine. You come to my mine and you spend the whole day in my office, you spend a week on the mine, finding out who mobilized against who, what were the issues, and where did the fight happen, how many people were killed. You go away, you write up a report, you send me the report, and then you charge me for that report. I'm a typical consultant. So they weren't interested in paying for this work anymore, basically. I mean, what they wanted, rather, was something more proactive. So we were then tasked to design an instrument that would measure the climate of employee opinion on a mine, which I did. And that instrument really gave us the insights that came from the use of that initial climate work, which, by the way, was done. We'd spoken to just short of 10,000 people on 37 shafts around the industry. So it's quite a substantial piece of work. That gave us the core categories to start developing what we've subsequently come to understand as the care and growth thematic. The care and growth thematic is more than a leadership theory. A lot of people think it is basically because I've published a book called The Leadership, the Care and Growth Model, The caring growth idea is bigger than just leadership. It deals with the whole problem of excellence, if you like. Now, I left the chamber in '89 because I was really convinced that the stuff that we were doing had a wider appeal than just mines. And we've been really blessed. We've had the opportunity to take this work all over the world. As you can see, we've worked in 27 countries around the world. We now have 4 operating offices in our business. The mothership, obviously, here in South Africa. And then the eldest sibling being in Pakistan, and then we've got 2 newer operations, one in Australia and one in Sweden. And we've worked with an incredibly diverse range of clients over the years. I mean, there's kind of like, I won't bore you with the details, but the reason for indicating this is that I'm absolutely convinced that the insights that we started to arrive at based on this initial research in the mining industry in the 80s, these insights are absolutely universal. They're universally true. And they all point to a single kind of phenomenon. And that is, if you're trying to account for the issue of success, then the issue of the intent to give accounts for the issue of personal excellence. What I mean by personal excellence is basically the problem of being a human being in a human skin. What does it feel like to be yourself? It accounts for the problem of team excellence. In other words, the whole issue of collaboration in organizations. It accounts for what makes hierarchy succeed or fail. And we understand leadership specifically through the lens of hierarchy and the overall success of an organization. And you might ask, so well, how does the intent to give account for the success of an organization? And if you look at sort of, sort of like a business, for example. So, for me, the way into this is to ask yourself, well, what are businesses there for? And, it's not helpful to think of businesses as being fundamentally there just to serve the shareholders or owners, to enrich owners, because just think about it logically. If here we have a little old lady selling vegetables. So ask yourself the question, does supply exist to serve demand, or does demand exist to serve supply? And clearly, supply exists for demand. Sellers are there for buyers, which means companies exist for customers and clients. It is only once you serve a customer and a client well that you actually have that you have the right to exist in the market. The difference between a business and a gang, a criminal gang, is that the criminal gang is there for itself. Businesses are there for customers and clients. Now, the first thing one needs to understand is that this intent to give, to serve the customer or the client, this is not an old, it's not a new idea. It's been around for a while. This very strange man, he was, I won't go into why he was strange, but he was quite peculiar. W.J.K. Kellogg, the man who created the cornflakes company, he had this view. He said the purpose of a business is not to make a profit. What a demeaning and dreary description. The purpose of a business is to add value to people's lives. The consequence of doing that well is that you make a handsome profit. So this is not an old idea, but this is not a new idea that businesses are there to serve customers and clients. But what one has to understand about this issue of the intent to serve or give is that no business has an intent, because a business is a collective. It is only individual human beings that have an intent. So this intent to give actually has to be found at a granular level on the basis of the individual in the business. You account for the success of the whole business on the basis of the intent of the individual. Even if you were to be so crude as to say the business only exists because it produces a profit, let's just call it something else. Let's call it a surplus, because there might be some socialists in the group, which we don't want to upset. We all love the socialists. So if we say businesses exist to kind of produce either a profit or a surplus, let's ask ourselves, well, how that happens. And we have this analogy, we call it the 3 bakers analogy. So let's say we've got 3 bakers who collaborate to bake a cake. It takes them a whole month to bake the cake, and at the end of the month, the cake is sold, and then each baker takes a slice home to feed their family. Clearly, there's a slice left, and you would call that slice a surplus if you're a socialist, a profit if you're a capitalist. But the point is, you would measure the success of the business on the basis of the size of that slice vis-a-vis the rest of the cake. Now, if this is true, we need to ask ourselves why this slice exists in the first place. Surely that slice only exists because the total cake that was baked was bigger than what each individual took home. In other words, the question to ask is, collectively, have these people given more than what they've taken, or have they taken more than what they've given? And clearly, they've given more than what they've taken, which means any group succeeds based on the degree to which the individual in the group gives unconditionally in pursuit of the group's objectives. Now, sorry, I went a bit fast there. So the obvious question is, well, how do you account for this intent of the individual to give? Why do people come to work? What are the conditions that make it possible for people to come to work to give? And honestly, I mean, there are a number of reasons, I think, but the most profound is really how the group is led, because you must understand that people go the extra mile for people. So if you want to understand the conditions under which people are going to come to work to make a discretionary contribution, give more than what they take in pursuit of the group's objectives, then you must don't ask yourself what is the organization they're working for. Ask yourself who's the boss. And it's precisely at this level, when you start examining who's the boss, leadership, that you start kind of coming to the first kind of quandary with regard to how most organizations struggle with this problem of cultivating people who come to work to make a contribution or to give. Because if you ask the average leader in an organization to describe what leadership is, so what you have here is a set of categories that I got from a group that I trained some time ago. This is literally verbatim of what they said, and we just took it down. On the board, this is what people said. You know, so what leadership means to leaders is coach, inspire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you take this content and you distill it, there's basically two categories in this content. First of all, this content is about people, you know, coaching people, listening to people, and so, you know, showing passion. It is about people, but then it is also about an outcome, like a vision, or even if you say set a goal, and some sort of an outcome or a result, which means that in people's minds, when they think through the problem of leadership, they kind of come up with a basic line of text that looks like this. Leadership is about achieving a result through people. Now, that view that leadership is about achieving a result through people is actually deeply toxic. If you, as a leader, think it's your job to achieve a result through people, you won't cultivate people who come to work to give. You'll cultivate takers. And we have a thought experiment that helps to demonstrate the case. The thought experiment refers to the difference between two people working for you. So there's a couple of things you need to assume about this thought experiment. First of all, you've got two people working for you. The one is called Joe and the other one is called Harry. And the second one, Stefan, is you as old as I am. Otherwise, the thought experiment, as you'll see, won't work. Right. So, and what we're going to try and work out in this thought experiment is which one of these people are going to work for you because they have to, and who's going to work for you because they really want to. So, in other words, who's going to come to work to kind of just get something out of the organization? It has to be here. And who's actually going to make a discretionary contribution, work because they want to. So you go up, the first person you kind of approach. Now, what we have to assume also in this thought experiment is that you are very experienced in a job that both Fred and Joe have to do, because you did that job in 1980, and you did it particularly well. So you come to Fred and you say to Fred, Fred, in 1980, I did what you have to do now, and what I did worked. Don't argue with me, Fred. Shut up. Go do what I did. Right. You go to Joe and you say to Joe, Joe, in 1980, I did what you have to do and what I did worked. It may be helpful to take a look at it. Now, if the question is who's going to work because they have to and who's going to work because they want to, then clearly Fred's going to work because he has to and Joe's going to work because he wants to. Now, the question is why? And you could say that actually in the Joe case, your whole attitude is kind of more democratic, you're more approachable, you sort of, because Joe can make a decision that Fred can't make, and all of that is true. But the problem is that it's not true enough. There's something going on under the surface that's not immediately apparent, which has got something to do with how means and ends pattern in these statements. So what you need to do in each statement is take either the person or the job and put them in the position of means and ends. So if we examine the Fred interaction, if you said to Fred in 1980, I did what you have to do now, and what I did worked. What you're trying to do is you're trying to get the same job done as you got in 1980. And by definition, you're using Fred, the person, as your resource to get the job done. If we assume in the Joe interaction that you meant what you said, you're not bullshitting Joe. If you said to Joe in 1980, I did what you have to do and what I did worked, it may be helpful to you. Take a look at it. The question is, could you have a different outcome from what you had in 1980? And yes, you could. In fact, you could even say it's conceivable you could have a disastrous outcome. So in other words, in the Joe interaction, you're not trying to get a job done because the job could be a disaster. What you're actually trying to do is you're trying to teach Joe, the person, something. And what gives you an opportunity to teach Joe, the person, something is the job that they're doing. So there's a peculiar thing happening under the surface that's not immediately apparent. It's about an inversion of means and ends. In the Fred case, you're using the person as the means to get a job done. And in the Joe case, you're using the job as an opportunity to teach the person something. Now, that shift indicates that there's actually been a shift in your intent as the leader. Because if you ask Fred, who's the beneficiary of this interaction that you're having with your boss? Fred's going to say, my boss, he's trying to get something out of me. If you ask Joe exactly the same question, who's the beneficiary of this interaction? He's going to say, me, the guy's trying to be helpful to me. Now, this is exactly the point, folks. If we say that the organization succeeds based on the degree to which the average person goes the extra mile, you have to understand that people don't go the extra mile for takers. So if you define the word leadership through this lens, if you say leadership is about achieving a result through people, then by definition, you're talking about the Fred interaction. Because this statement is using the person as the means in order to get a job done. If you wanted to be consistent with the Joe interaction, you'd have to do something really peculiar to that statement. If you were to invert means and ends in that statement, you'd have to say something like, leadership is about achieving people through results. Now, when people take a first look at that statement, they think, yeah, but this is insane. You can only smoke dacha to come up with something like this. This doesn't even make sense, But I'd like to suggest to you it makes perfect sense if you just shift frame. Because this is exactly what a coach does. A coach doesn't produce a result. That's what players do. If you are one of these kids playing in this team and your coach said to you, listen, you lot, my job is to achieve a result. I'm going to use you as my resources to achieve that result. How would you play for this guy? You'd probably loosen his wheel nuts if he's lucky. Put some poison in his tea because it's not his job. That's your job. Now, that doesn't suggest that the coach doesn't have a job. His job is to coach you, the player. Which doesn't mean to say he's got no interest in the game that's being played and no interest in the result, because you can't coach a game if you don't know, what the results are. You can't coach a game if you don't know what's happening on the field. But it doesn't make that the coach's job. It makes those two things the coach's means to do his job, which is to coach the player, which suggests the coach doesn't use the player to get a job done and to achieve a result. He actually uses the result and the job as his means to enable the player. The coach's product is a player. Now, folks, wherever this penny has dropped in the consciousness of a leadership team, wherever, in my experience, wherever a leadership team has suddenly understood, listen, our deliverable is not a result to the business. Our product is not the result. Our product is the excellence of the people who report to us. And we've been given the grace of having this business as a gymnasium to cultivate excellent people. We're using the business as a gymnasium to cultivate extraordinary people. Then from that point forward, that business will always take off. But while people think that their job is to achieve a result, the leaders think that their job is to achieve a result through people, that organization always stays in crisis because you don't have people who come to work to make a contribution. Now, if you want to ask yourself then, taking this sort of a bit further, what exactly does the leader do if the leader does cultivate people who come to to work because they want to, then that's a question we've also asked many people over the years, to describe the boss that they work for because they want to. And a typical sort of list of things would be like the following: a boss is interested in me, a boss is supportive, etc., etc. Now, if you look through the list, what becomes apparent very quickly is that although there might be a large plethora of categories in the list, there actually are themes. So you can reduce the list to some core categories. In fact, you can do quite a radical reduction to the list. There's really only two themes in this list. First of all, there's a soft and a kind theme, which you can describe as care. I work, so people who work for a boss because they want to, if the boss is interested in them, is supportive, is approachable, has empathy, listens, sort of, again, supportive, defends you, very similar idea. In other words, that the boss is there for them, not just to get something out of them. What people are saying to the boss is, listen, don't just be here to get something out of me, have a genuine interest in me, care about me. But then there's a harder theme. Like, for instance, if you work for somebody who's always honest with you, that boss isn't always going to be nice. And then you ask, why is it that you would want that kind of tough theme, this sort of honesty, for example? Well, if I don't know where I stand, how can I fix? How can I change? How can I learn? How can I grow? So the benefit to the subordinate of the harder theme is growth. I mean, that's why people want a boss as a mentor. A boss is a clear communicator. A boss explains how you contribute. A boss is empowering. I mean, that's a kind of a synonym for growth. A boss who coaches, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if people define the kind of boss that they work for because they want to, universally, they'll say these two things, care and growth. Now, what I find really interesting about this care and growth categories, folks, is that it is yet to be contradicted. I've asked this people literally now, probably of tens of thousands of people throughout the world. Initially with the initial training we did at the Chamber of Mines, let's say, for instance, you're dealing with a guy who shovels rock for a living, that has had no formal education in his life. He only speaks speaks an African language. He's a completely uneducated person. You ask this person, who's the boss you're going to work for because you want to? Guess what he says? The boss who cares for me and grows me. We subsequently asked that question of people throughout the world. Senior officers in the Pakistan Army, for example. You ask this guy, who's the officer you'll follow because you want to? And he says, the officer who cares for me and grows me. Which suggests that these care and growth criteria are actually completely universal. They're true for every human being on the planet. I mean, you see it from that point of view, the universality really makes sense. I mean, this question, who's the boss you're going to work for because you want to, is less simple than it appears. Because if you work, let's assume you work for somebody because you want to. So it's somebody who does all of this sort of stuff for you, basically cares for you and grows you. And this person comes to you one day and asks you to do something. What will you do? You'll do it. In other words, you give this person the right to ask you to do something or to exercise power over you, which suggests that these care and growth criteria are the criteria for legitimate power. I mean, you see it from that point of view, the universality of the criteria make absolute sense. The first relationship of power you had with any other human being in your life was with your parents. And insofar as it's a principal relationship. But what I mean by this is that, there's a connection between the idea of first and the idea of principle. If you want to understand the principle of a matter, look at the first manifestation of the matter. The first manifestation of power is parenting. In this relationship, there are two people. There's a big one and there's a little one. The job of the big one for the little one is very specific. It is care and growth. In other words, any relationship of power is legitimate if the aim of that relationship is the care and growth of the subordinate. This is what power is supposed to do for people. So in other words, if people work in an organization where they look up at the hierarchy, where they look up at those who are exercising power, and they assess that these people are actually here to give to us, they're actually here to make us special, care for us and grow us, that's when people commit to the organization and go the extra mile. Why? Because they experience the power of the boss as legitimate. And this idea of growing people isn't just about being nice. I mean, that's one of the things that one really has to understand about what people want from a boss. People don't always want somebody who's kind of negotiable and sort of pleasant and sweet, you know. People want to be empowered. So if you kind of, what you say, well, what does that actually mean practically? What does it mean to grow people practically? You know, you've heard the sort of rule of thumb, eh? Don't give a man a fish, empower them to fish, you know. So if you wanted to empower somebody to fish, if you wanted to enable somebody to fish, the question is, what would you give that person? And clearly you'd have to start off with some stuff. You'd have to give them, you know, a hook, a line, and a sinker, and some bait and a boat. And if he's an Australian, you'll give him beer. If he's South African, you probably need to give him brandy. Anyhow, you give him stuff. But that's not going to be good enough, because you've got to teach the person how to use that stuff. You know, how to bait a hook, where you should cast, why you should fish, etc., etc. Now, you can carry on for a long time, but what becomes apparent is that there's the difference between these two categories is kind of like a software-hardware distinction. You know, all of these things are things that sit outside of the person. That's why you call these things means. And this, you know, the second category refers to the person's competency or skill that sits inside the person. You can call that ability. Now, you have to understand that you don't empower somebody just by giving them the means and the ability to do what's required of them. Because let's say, for instance, you're dealing with me, and I'm a particularly lazy person. And you really want to empower me to fish. You give me all the means I could require to do it, to catch these fish. Give me all the ability I require. But yet I can see you're all very nice people. So because you're nice people, you also have a freezer at home full of fish, because you catch a lot. And after doing all of this, you say to me, Ahmed, don't worry. If you don't catch a fish, I'm going to give you one. I'll give you one from my freezer. You know, how willingly am I going to fish? In fact, I'm not going to fish willingly at all. So there's a last thing that you have to bring to the party that actually engages my will, which is something around like, you know, if you don't catch a fish after this, starve. It's called accountability. In other words, what I'm suggesting here, folks, is empowering people means three things and not just two. It means to give people the means to do what's required of them, to make them able to do what's required of them, and to hold them accountable. And if you don't do all three of those things, you do not empower people, you disable them. So you have to understand that if we argue that the boss is there to give rather than to take, this giving isn't just about being sweet and nice. It is about being passionate enough about the person to cultivate an adult who is accountable. So if you wanted to translate this into an organizational context, you say, well, what would be consistent, for instance, with the idea of means? Well, that would be to give the person the tools to do what's required of them, to give them the resources to do what's required of them, the authority they may need, whatever information they may need, etc. Ability is a bit of a sort of a kind of more concise category. You've got to teach people how to do what's required of them and why they should do it. Then the issue of accountability, I mean, it kind of makes sense that you can't hold anybody accountable for anything if there isn't a clear standard for what's required of somebody. So running through the middle of the problem of accountability is the issue of standards, which suggests that somebody's performance can either be kind of above standard on the right here, or it can be below standard. Somebody's performance can be above standard in one of two ways. They're either going the extra mile, or they are careful to meet the standard that you specified, or the person is below standard because they're completely malevolent. In other words, they deliberately do what's unacceptable. And I'm not just a mean old guy. I mean, people are sometimes deliberately malevolent, or the person is careless. Now, the question is, well, what's appropriate? Well, our view is that if the person has gone the extra mile, you should reward them. If they're careful, you should recognize them. If they're deliberately malevolent, you should actually punish them. And what that means in an organizational context, you should dismiss them. This isn't the Middle Ages anymore. You can't sort of take people to the backyard and sort of put them up against the wall. You can't do that anymore. And if they're careless, you should censure them. In other words, warn them. Now, what makes this instrument useful, folks, is it really gives you a very simple kind of compass to deal with performance-related issues. You know, in other words, if you're trying to empower somebody to do something, and you then assessing their performance afterwards, the first question to ask yourself is, if they've not performed well, do they have the means to do what's required of them? If not, then this is your problem. Fix the means. If, however, they do have the means to do what's required of them, ask yourself, are they able to do what's required of them? And if they aren't, then help them, coach them, make them able. But if they have the means to do what's required of them, and they're perfectly able to do what's required of them, you have to hold the person accountable. So there's a dividing line here that sets this means and ability up as a precondition for accountability. So I hope it makes sense to you that this care and growth idea isn't just about being sweet and nice to people. It is, growth means to cultivate adults, people who are accountable. And people are only, if they are accountable, they get held accountable. Right. So this thing of being able to give to your people isn't about just being nice. Now, the next thing I'd like to point out is that if you look at this idea of the organization succeeding based on people being there to make a contribution rather than being there to take, the next question to explore is, well, where would you see that actually? How do you get a sense whether an organization is healthy or not? And actually, you'll see it in the degree to which people collaborate. You'll see that in how teams function and teams operate, because this idea of the intent to give or serve also accounts for excellence in teams. Because if you think about any team, a team sport, for example, like soccer, surely most of the work that happens on the field is not about somebody scoring. Most of the work that happens is about somebody trying to set somebody else up to score. In other words, if you look at this from the point of the intent of the individual who's trying to set his colleague up to score, is he's saying to his colleague, listen, I'm quite happy for you to be the star. In other words, folks, if you populate a team with people who are all there trying to be the star themselves, you by definition don't have a team. You've got a herd of cats. You only have a team based on the degree to which the average individual is actually willing to make their colleague the star, has the magnanimity of spirit to make their colleague the star. So you account for the issue of collaboration in teams with exactly the same variable of the intent to serve. When people in a team are wanting to be the star themselves, you don't have a team. When people in the team are willing to make others the star in the team, you have a team. When they're there to give to their colleagues. Now, this idea of being there to give to my colleague, then, if you can almost track how that develops in a group. So you can track how the sort of cohesiveness in the group sort of is a function of the maturation of each individual in the group and the maturation of the intent of each individual in the group. So I'd like you to think of, explore this idea of this group of people sort of moving from being just a group of freestanding individuals to being a team, something that works coherently. And consider two axes in the process. First of all, there's the maturation of each individual from basically quite sort of immature, being here to take, just being here for myself, to being here to give, being mature. And then also what is made significant by that person. From just my own interest or the interests of the group. Now, what this suggests is that this then creates two trajectories, two movements. So as people mature, the individual increasingly functions less and less as a freestanding individual and more deliberately, because they want to, as a member of the team. And the effect on the group then is that the group is less and less as a group of freestanding individuals and more as a coherent team. So if you think about as each individual matures, going along this axis over here, you can see that the connectivity between the individuals kind of increases. So the degree to which people move along this continuum, the more the group starts to operate less as a group of freestanding individuals and more as a team of people. So this idea that the team is bigger than the sum of its parts is only true based on the degree to which the average individual is there to give, is there to make their colleague the star. Now, everything that I've said so far sort of conspires to quite for many people initially quite a bitter pill, Because what we're saying is that the overall success of the organization is actually based on the intent of the individual. And if you're an individual in a leadership capacity, that means your intent has to be there to give, to be there to care for and grow your subordinates. And if we kind of then look at what that means for you and your colleagues, it means that when you deal with your colleague, you deal with your colleague with the intent to set your colleague up to succeed. So what this suggests is that moment by moment, whether you're engaging the whole business, whether you're engaging colleagues, whether you're engaging subordinates, the hierarchy, the fundamental rule is you're there for any other interest other than yours. You're there to give. Now, when people swallow this pill, they gag. They say, this is nuts. You're asking me to cut my own throat. What about me? And I'd like to suggest to you that this issue of the intent to give actually also accounts for the problem of being a human being in a human skin. Because if you ask the average person, what do you actually want from life? Or even maybe just a little bit more pragmatic. Why do you go to work? Then basically you'll be able to tease the following 4 categories of responses from them. First of all, they'll say things like, I'd like to earn a living. I'd like to get some money, be able to provide for my family, maintain my lifestyle. All issues that are concerned with security. Then also, there's a second category of stuff, which is about job satisfaction, learning for the challenge, to develop my skills. And these really sort of refer to the sense of personal satisfaction or fulfillment. So it's really about one's fulfillment, the sort of satisfaction. Then what's also important for people is things like to build their career, for status. They don't want to fail, to achieve some sense of success. And what's interesting about this category is that it's kind of competitive in character. I don't think there's anybody alive who's quite willing to sort of die a nobody. Nobody wants to die nobody. Everybody wants to be a somebody. So we all have this bit of a competitive edge. We want to rise up in life. So it really is about power. It's about becoming superior, going up, if you like, becoming significant in the eyes of others. Then there's a last sort of reason, which is almost in essence the opposite of this power theme, like to make a contribution, develop my people, I believe in what in other words, a theme that feels more almost, it's a kinder theme, it's a more collaborative theme. And you can say that theme is really about harmony. So what I'm suggesting is if you ask people, why do they work? What's important to them? What do they want from life? What do they aspire to? You'll always be able to reduce it to these 4 themes: security, fulfillment, power, and harmony. Now, the problem is that most people, if you ask them, why do you go to work? They say, I go to work for this stuff. And where's their place of work? Their place of work is out there. They get into a car to go to work. In other words, they think they're going to find the stuff at work. What they don't realize is that we don't get that stuff at work. We take this stuff to work, because every one of these things are actually the product of something that happens on the inside. It's the product of how your intent operates. So if you have a look at your intent, so here's this rather charming lady, her intent in any situation that she's in, she can either construct her intent on what she's trying to get, or she can construct her intent on what she can give. Now, this is true for every human being alive. In any situation, you can either construct your intent on what sits here, or you can construct your intent on what sits here. There's really dramatic implications for all 4 of these things: security, fulfillment, power, and harmony, with regard to where you base your intent. Let's say, for instance, I base my security on anything that I get from the world. A salary, some assets, maybe a pension. If I base my security on what I'm getting from the world, the question to ask is, how often does the world that you're in give you exactly what you want at that particular point in time? And actually, the answer is never. So if you're going to base your security on what you're getting from the world, you'll never be secure. You will stay insecure. Whereas if I base my security on the quality of what I'm contributing in any given point in time, because I've always got control over the quality of what I'm contributing, I'll always be secure. So the difference between being insecure and secure is not the assets. Really, you have to understand this, folks. Otherwise, you cannot account for the fact that you can have tremendously wealthy people who are miserably insecure. There's no relationship between how much you own and how secure you feel. In fact, I can make a really good argument for the opposite. In other words, the more things you own, the less secure you are. And the asset that most dramatically demonstrates this is ownership of a house. I mean, most of us have this view that, if I've paid off the bankers and the title deed to my house is in my own safe, then I'm secure. I own my house. Now that's kind of quite an interesting idea, because if you say, well, if something makes you secure, what does it promise to do for you? What does something that makes you secure do? Well, the first thing it'll do is it'll protect you. Like your house is going to do that. Hey, I mean, let's assume I've paid off the bankers. The title deed to my house is in my safe. I come home from town this afternoon, and there's a thug that waits just outside my door. And just as I walk up to my house, he leaps out from behind a bush and he beats me to within an inch of my life. I don't think my house is going to run to my defense. My house isn't going to throw a brick at their assailant and say, hey, you can't, Murim is my boss. Huh? In other words, there's not a single asset that you have that's going to rally to your defense when the crisis hits when the pauper hits the fan. I mean, there's not a single asset that you own that has ever admitted any custodial responsibility with regard to you. But you've done the opposite. In other words, let's assume I come back home from work, and this time I don't get assaulted by the thug. But what happened is that this hooligan broke into my house while I was at work and completely vandalized my house. Cementing all the plumbing, all the glassware smashed, red paint on the Persians. I mean, you just can't believe how awful the excuse the terrible experience. The question is, will I be cross? And of course I'll be cross. So who's there to look after who? Am I there to look after the house, or is the house there to look after me? And clearly, I'm there to look after the house. So do you understand, folks? While not a single asset that you have has admitted any custodial responsibility with regard to you, it will not rush to your defense. You've accepted a custodial responsibility with regard to every one of your assets. If the hooligans want to break your stuff, you get upset. In other words, your assets don't take care of you. You have to take care of them. You don't own yourself into being secure. You own yourself into being insecure, because the more things you own, the more things can get taken away from you. That's not suggest that you shouldn't own things, but just don't root your security in them. Exactly the same argument is actually true for fulfillment as well. If I base my sense of happiness and contentment on what I'm getting from the world, because the world rarely gives me what I want at that particular point in time, I'll be discontented. Whereas if I base my happiness and contentment on the quality of what I'm contributing, because I've always got control over what the quality of what I'm contributing, I'll be fulfilled. This issue of power is very interesting, because let's say, for instance, So Stefan, just because I can see you, I'm just going to use you as the fall guy in this. Please excuse me, but I'm assuming you'll have a phone proximate to you, somewhere near you. All right, and can you show what is it, Stefan? What's your phone?
It's my phone is it's on charge. Yeah.
What is it? What kind of phone is it?
It's an iPhone.
Okay, I want an iPhone. When I grew up, I also want an iPhone. All right, so Stefan, you and I are in the same room, and I notice your phone, and I say to you, I said to you, give me your phone. If I want your phone, who can withhold the phone?
I can.
So who's got power over who?
I've got power over the phone.
Which means you'll have power over me, because you can withhold the phone. You understand? In other words, when you deal with somebody on the basis of what you're trying to get from them, the other has power over you. While I'm trying to get something from you, your ability to withhold what I want makes me manipulable. I'm under your thumb. You have power over me. How do I escape this tyranny? Well, I shift my intent in my engagement from you, from what I'm trying to get from you, to how I can be helpful to you. Because the moment I do that, you can't withhold the phone anymore. I slip out from underneath your ability to manipulate me, and I become powerful. So when you deal with the other, the world, on the basis of what you're trying to get, you become a victim. The world defines you. If you want to have some real sense of autonomy, some real sense of power, some real sense of kind of standing out and not being under the thumb of others, that comes at a price, and that is the price to give. This issue of giving accounts for power in whatever the situation that you're in. It even accounts for something as simple as how prices get set. I mean, if you go to an auction, you see a price being set. So the price is going up, 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 at some point gets set. When does that happen? When somebody says, I won't pay more. In other words, the person who can lose the transaction defines the value of the transaction. The person who can't lose the transaction is still kind of negotiable. So the transaction will define them. This issue of the Stefan phone rule, let's call it the Stefan phone rule, it goes the theorem. The Stefan phone rule actually also accounts for the issue of harmony, because we've now already accounted for this fact that while I want Stefan's phone, his ability to hold the phone gives him power over me. He can manipulate me. I'm vulnerable to him. But not only is Stefan dangerous to me, but precisely because I'm trying to get the phone out of Stefan, I mean, the first thing guys was, does this guy have a martial art? Is he kind of, in other words, Stefan will experience me as dangerous to him. So while I want the phone, Stefan is dangerous to me, and simultaneously I'm dangerous to him. And if the two of us are dangerous with each other, we're going to have conflict. If I shift my intent from the phone which I'm trying to get from Stefan to how I can be helpful to Stefan, in that instance, he can't withhold the phone anymore. I slip out from underneath his ability to manipulate me, and I become powerful. I'm safe from Stefan. Not only am I safe from Stefan, but precisely because I'm trying to be helpful to Stefan, he is now safe from me. And when I'm safe from him and he's safe from me, we have harmony. So you have to understand, folks, this issue, these things that we want from life, security, fulfillment, power, and harmony, we manufacture them on the inside, because every one of them is the product of how our intent operates. So if you're trying to account for the issue of human excellence, this problem of being a human being, then clearly, in the first instance, we can say that it's all based on the intent to give. It accounts for this problem of being in a human skin. It accounts for your own sense of security and fulfillment. And then if we sort of take that out to say, how does this intent to give then affect your relationships with others? Well, actually, it's precisely that produces your sense of harmony with others. Your intent to make your colleague the star produces harmony in the team. And if we say, well, how does this then affect power? I'm in a hierarchy. Well, if you're there to care for and grow your subordinates, then you become powerful. They become loyal to you. They work because they want to, not just because they have to. And that all then rolls up to the success of the entire organization, which means you account for the issue of success on the basis of a single variable, which is the intent to give of the individual. Our organization specializes in the issue of cultivating this intent. And we do that in the first instance by helping people to discover the tools whereby they can become fulfilled and secure. We also help teams with processes to create the conditions where peers are there to set each other up to succeed. We help organizations and leaders in organizations to understand what makes the authority and the power that they have over their subordinates legitimate. Understand, folks, just because you have the tinsel on your shoulders, because you have the rank, because the organization has given you a designation, that doesn't mean to say you've got power. You only have power when the people who are working for you are there because they want to be there. And in order to have that, you've got to do what power is supposed to do, which is to care for them and grow them. We also help organizations to kind of, and people to build an enterprise that actually does make a contribution to the world, because there's some organizational and contextual things you've got to bear in mind when you're trying to cultivate people who are there to give. And the first thing is that you've got to approach your entire organization from the point of view of how does this thing enable autonomy? How do our systems enable the autonomy of the individual? How much is there too much control in an organization? How does our hierarchy function? How do our systems and processes function? In order to assist enterprises to do this, we have four kinds of types of product offering. We diagnose, We do diagnostic work in organizations, that both in terms of sort of how leaders are viewed, how the culture of the organization, the sort of organizational effectiveness. We do consulting work, and what I mean by consulting work is we help to design culture transformation processes. We train people. There's a big component of what we do. We help people understand, for instance, if you're in a leadership position, what is it that you should be doing for the people reporting to you? And we also coach individual leaders.